Intel. The U.S. takes a 10% stake. Hey everyone, it's Wolfgang. So the U.S. announced a 10% position in Intel this week. Yesterday, actually. Today's the 23rd. Yesterday, they made the announcement. It was the 22nd of August, 2025. Okay, so 3 years ago, during the former President Biden, the CHIPS Act was announced in 2022. So a lot of things, a lot of benefits were supposed to come to the U.S. from the CHIPS Act. The whole idea is to reduce dependency on outside parties to provide what the U.S. now knows is a critical resource, computer chips. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video, a little background, and then the story, we'll get into it a little bit. One thing I want to say, I think that everyone knows that I spilled a glass of water on my daily driver laptop. I have a lot of laptops, but the one in particular got the most use, had the most relevant up-to-date data on it, and it was put out to pasture unexpectedly. I spilled a glass of water on it. So today I was able to retrieve data from the solid-state drive. It had a multi-terabyte solid-state drive on that computer. The computer is basically toast. It will not power on. The screen is dark completely, but I was still able to retrieve data from the solid-state drive. So the solid-state drive replaces the hard drive in some computers. In this one in particular, there was no hard drive. So it was all the data was on a solid-state drive. So if you have a situation like that, do not give up hope. What you should search on for a type of device that I got to recover this data, search on SSD enclosure. SSD is an acronym for solid state drive. Search for SSD enclosure and you'll see a long list of companies. You just have to pay really close attention to the type of connector that your SSD, your solid state drive has in your computer. It's going to depend on a lot of different factors or different variations. So I had to pay attention to the design of the actual connector that the SSD used to connect into the motherboard. I had to pay attention to that to select the correct SSD enclosure. Once I got past that, it was basically order it, wait for it to arrive, and see if I get lucky and I'm able to retrieve the data, and I was able to. So even if you have a computer that is a boat anchor, like mine is, you can still retrieve data from the SSD drive. Just look for SSD enclosure. Okay, so let's get back to this video. So the US took a 10% stake in Intel. And the timing was a little bit unusual because it came right after the president had some really critical things to say about the CEO of the company, and then all of a sudden, the U.S. is taking a 10% stake. So the timing was a little bit odd, and people also questioned the reasoning behind, why do we need a 10% stake in Intel? I'm going to explain that as we go through this video, why that might be the case, why that might be a good idea. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is the 2022 CHIPS Act, because everything I'm going to talk about sort of hinges on that legislation. So let's talk about this 10% stake. The first question people have, and it's natural, was this sort of a control move? We want to control Intel. They're struggling. Let's get our hands dirty as the U.S. government will get in there with a 10% stake and start taking over. So what exactly is a controlling interest? 10% sounds like an awful lot. If you tried to buy 10% of a huge business like Intel, not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of money. 10% is a huge stake. So what exactly is a controlling interest like that? Does it involve seats or a seat on the board of directors of the company? Does it give influence on how the company runs? You take a 10% stake, do you suddenly get a say in how the company runs? Do you get any choice on who gets hired into senior or executive roles? So at a minimum, do you get direct communication from Intel as to what's going on at the company? So 10% stake, was that a control move by the U.S. government? Was it a controlling interest? No. Does the U.S. get a seat, even one, on the board of directors? No. Does the U.S. get any influence on how the company runs? No, not direct influence. Does the U.S. get any control over who gets hired for senior positions? No. Does the U.S. get direct communication from Intel as to what is going on? Maybe if they want it, but if you're giving up all of this, if you're not getting any such benefits, you don't really have a controlling interest. So people wondered, was this 10% stake the U.S. made, was it an attempt to for the U.S. to get their hands dirty and to have some influence on the company? And you can see the answer is kind of no. The U.S. is not, they own a big, the U.S. owns a big chunk of Intel, 10%, and that's about it. And maybe some extra communication. So it's a little bit frustrating. Why is the U.S. buying that much of a stake in the company? So it's going to come back to the 2022 CHIPS Act. Okay, I'll get to this reason why they did this. Okay, so let's talk about the CEO visit to the White House. That occurred on the 11th of this month, August 2025. The CEO of Intel met with the U.S. president on August 11th. A 10% stake was announced in Intel by the U.S. about 11 days later, on August 22nd. So 11 days after the U.S. meets with the CEO of Intel, all of a sudden we're announcing the stake of 10%. There were rumors that that was going to happen between the 11th and the 22nd. There were rumors that the U.S. was going to take a huge stake in the company. And did people believe it? I don't know, because people wondered, well, if the U.S. is going to get some sort of control over Intel, maybe it sort of makes sense. But why would why would the U.S. want to do that? It's got something to do with the 2022 CHIPS Act. Okay, so let's talk about the U.S. having a sovereign wealth fund, because in a sense, by taking a big stake in a company like Intel like this, it's sort of asking for a payback from Intel. And even though there's no control being asserted, there is this request from the government that Intel get their act together, improve their business, and have certain benefits accrue to the U.S. Okay, certain benefits need to accrue to the U.S., starting with what Intel announced back when this act passed. Intel made an announcement back in 2022 when the CHIPS Act passed, okay? And Intel has not delivered on that promise, on that commitment yet. So what the U.S. is doing partly is letting Intel know, we observed that you made this commitment back in 2022 to create chip manufacturing back in the U.S., in Ohio specifically, in the state of Ohio. So the U.S. is seeking repayment for the 2022 CHIP Act grants. So the U.S. is basically, sort of in a nice way, is sort of like, if your dad put his arm around your shoulder and said, son, you've got to do a little bit better here, then you would start making effort to fit expectations that you had set. After all, if Intel told the U.S. back when the CHIPS Act passed, we will build chip manufacturing in Ohio, then this is almost 4 years later, almost 48 months, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025 is almost over. So almost 48 months, almost 4 years later, the Intel should be close to or should have delivered on the promise to create IC chips, computer chips in Ohio. They have not. They haven't done it. So the U.S. is seeking repayment for those grants because certain grants were given by the U.S. to these chip companies. Intel. There's a list of these companies. NVIDIA, Advanced Micro Devices, AMD. Let's see here. Texas Instruments, National Semiconductor, Qualcomm, and so on. There's a bunch of chip makers in the U.S., but right now, the goal is to increase U.S. manufacture of computer chips because right now Taiwan has the majority of computer chip manufacturing. It wasn't always this way. In the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, the United States had about 100% of worldwide chip manufacture. That's not that long ago. That's less than 3 decades ago. So within one generation, the U.S. has lost the lion's share of chip manufacturing. The CHIPS Act was the first attempt to try to convince these companies to onshore chip manufacturing. Because if you remember what happened in the COVID era, there were shortages of certain really critical things the U.S. needed and could not get because we did not make them. They were not being made in the U.S. So it's one thing to not be able to get ventilators and masks during a pandemic. It's something completely different if you have a car manufacturing company and you cannot sell your cars because you're waiting on computer chips that are not arriving. And that's actually what happened. During COVID, there was a shortage of chips, and the U.S. car manufacturers had to stop selling cars because they could not get chips delivered. If the chips were manufactured in the U.S., that would never have happened. So in 2022, the CHIPS Act was passed. Intel was given grants. Intel promised to build chip manufacturing in Ohio, and they have not done that. So the U.S. is taking a 10% stake in Intel to try to cash in to sort of push that agenda at Intel a little bit so that Intel delivers on that promise. Right now, as I said, Taiwan has the majority of chip manufacturing. Okay, so SoftBank made a $2 billion investment. And I put that in single quotes for a reason, okay? Because SoftBank seems to be in pursuit of notoriety, but are they delivering? Not sure yet, right? We're hearing a lot of noise. It's time to look for tangible signs that things are changing. One thing to look at would be, do we have computer chips being made in the US? Because we had 100% back in the mid-90s. Right now we have 8%. We've fallen from 100% to 8%. So SoftBank claims that they're making a $2 billion investment in Intel. That came after Intel laid off 15% of its employees. In 2022, Intel said new chip production in Ohio. 4 years later, it's not happening. That has been delayed. And the leadership in Ohio is enraged about that, and they're going after Intel, asking them, what is up here? You said you were going to start this. We created all this activity on the ground in Ohio to support a new chip fabrication plant. Intel is dropping the ball here, and that's why the U.S. government is sort of getting involved a little bit. So the 10% stake that the U.S. took, it's not a control move, but it is an influence move. And who knows what could come next. If the U.S. is taking a 10% stake in a big company like this that has made and broken a promise to solve a problem that the U.S. Congress, because the U.S. Congress passed this in 2022. The CHIPS Act was passed by Congress in 2022, almost 4 years ago. So Intel is letting down Ohio, the United States, and Congress by this particular law, the commitments they made to build this plant in Ohio. They are dropping the ball. So something needs to change in that company, and the U.S. is hoping taking a big stake will start that process. If it doesn't, I'm sure, I predict the U.S. will take further steps to get Intel to perform. It's a U.S.-based company. We should have more than 8% of computer chips being made in the U.S., more than 8%. That's my contention. So right now, Taiwan in particular has 45% of U.S. chips, not high-end chips, just regular run-of-the-mill, like memory chips, computer chips in general that are not specialized. About 45% come from Taiwan. Other percentages come from other countries. When I was at National Semiconductor, which is one of the chip companies, the fabs were being moved to Ireland at that time. I think it was Ireland, because the tax benefits that were being offered were just too good to pass up. So the U.S. is trying to fix these problems. So I couldn't fit everything on the board here. The CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 was incentive to U.S.-based companies to manufacture computer chips inside the U.S. And as of this month, August 2025, just about 4 years later, only 8% of the world's semiconductor chips are made in the U.S. We went from 100% in the mid-90s down to 8%. 100% down to 8%. That is bad, especially when we had a bunch of car manufacturers who could not sell cars because they could not get chips. So far, all we've had is talk and no action. So it is time to shift the focus and start looking for tangible outcomes. 4 years is plenty of time for a fab to be built and be running in Ohio, and it has not happened. So SoftBank has made this claim of an investment. This is nothing until we actually see something tangible, and the tangible thing we want to see is an 8% share of chips made in the U.S. to 50% of chips to be made in the U.S. That would be an improvement. SoftBank and others who have claimed to support this, they have to do more than just make these claims about these investments. Well, we're going to make this big investment. Show us. Don't tell us. Show us. All talk, no action. SoftBank has been a lot of talk, not too much action. So why is Taiwan a bad deal? Well, they're in the sights of China. China wants to take over the country by force. It's stupid, really stupid. It's tragically stupid that the U.S. would leave any kind of manufacturing in China or Taiwan. Any kind of manufacturing. It's really stupid, but especially computer chips, because it's one thing to not be able to sell cars. A lot of things in our lives need computer chips. They used to all be made in the U.S. We need to get back there. So that's sort of the takeaway. The 2022 CHIPS Act passed by Congress was a good thing. It was a good move. It was designed to start giving incentives to computer chip companies to move their manufacturing back to the US. So far, Intel is dragging its feet on this move to Ohio. And a couple of these companies, AMD and NVIDIA, are paying 15% of their sales that they make in China to the US. What's up with that? Sell the chips here. We need the chips here. Forget China. Let China worry about China. China is planning on taking over Taiwan. They just announced, a few days ago, I think, that they were going to wait until the current president was out of office before they did it. Something like that. So, and why should we have to worry about that when we know we need something locally? Let's make it locally, and then let the rest of the world do whatever it wants. That's sort of the rest of the world's problem. So if you have any questions about this, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have. I do have a background in technology. I did work in the semiconductor manufacturing industry, not just at National Semiconductor, at a few other companies on the engineering side early in my career. So if you have any questions, please post questions in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. And I really want to thank everyone for watching, and have a great day.